Evaluating Empirical Experimentation in Linguistic Studies.
A podcast by E. King and N. Sonderegger. We can all see in our day-to-day lives that the languages and dialects that people speak are frequently compared to each other, placed into hierarchies, and given values. As linguists, one important question is to evaluate how exactly these languages in competition are perceived. If we know this, we will be able to highlight the possible issues that arise with hierarchies and make them known to the public, so that they will potentially be able to help fight against discrimination. However, empirically researching the ways in which people put languages and dialects into competition has proven difficult. Like all scientific research, we have issues when we try to find a way to show reality with empirical values. In this podcast, we hope to highlight these issues, show the pros and cons of different types of research, and show how other researchers have dealt with getting data despite these struggles. To illustrate these issues, we'll first talk about language attitude research, moving on then to case studies with a few examples, and in the end we'll be defining some accents empirically, specifically sociolects and regiolects. And in the end we'll draw our conclusions based on what we talked about.
First of all, language attitude research. Language attitude research is identifying how a language group views the character and status of another language or accent. The example that we are going to use to talk about this type of empirical research is a study from Coupland and Bishop. Their paper about the study is called Ideologized Values of British Accents. In their paper, Coupland and Bishop talk about direct versus indirect approach to language attitude researches. A direct approach is an overtly asking the subjects about their impressions. This kind of approach shows the name of the accent or language and asks the test subjects to rate how they think about these impressions. An indirect approach is covertly evaluating how the subject feels. So in this approach, the subject is given an audio sample of the accent or language, and then after listening to different audio samples, they are told to rate them. The distinction between covert and overt comes from Labov's overt and covert prestige ideas. He said that the covert feelings help explain why people use linguistic features they overtly say they are negative. So what he observed was that many people were using linguistic features even though they were overtly saying that they were negative, and he was wondering why. And the answer to that question is that there is a difference between overt ideas of prestige and covert ideas of prestige. The overt are the ones that they say that they should think about the accent. But the covert ones are the ones that are deep inside of their brain that may or may not be subconscious. So the overt is more socially accepted, but the covert is what actually helps them socially act. One pro of the indirect approach is that the researcher gets to figure out things that people may not want to say explicitly. These are things, as I said before, that may be not very socially acceptable for them to say out loud, but with ways that the researcher presents these indirect ideas, they are able to extract that idea that that's how they believe. A second pro is that these beliefs, these indirect beliefs that people had, are more deeply held. And because the overt beliefs are more socially acceptable, the indirect ones are more deeply held and ingrained inside of the person's beliefs. Going off of Labov's experiment, we see that they are also arguably more influential to language change than overt options. As he experienced, these changes were not happening, even though overtly people were saying that these linguistic values were not very high. And a fourth pro of the indirect approach is there is no assumption needed on the part of the researcher that the test subjects refer to the same accent when they are making their judgment. If the test subjects are listening to an audio sample, then there is no question in the researcher's mind of if a person is thinking about a different accent than other test subjects. One pro of the direct approach is making language ideologies and stereotypes visible. So when the test subject gets a name of an accent or a language, we know that their opinions that they have given in the research are attached to this exact accent or language. Another pro is that there are less interfering features than with audio samples. When people speak, there are many different reasons why they pronounce things the way they pronounce, or why they use the words that they use. One of these reasons might be the stereotype that the researcher is currently researching. However, there are many other interfering features that can go along with why the person is saying what they are saying. For example, they could be speaking multiple accents at the same time that make up their personal idiolect. Or the person could have specific words that they use because of their small social group that they have that they throw into that isn't a part of the accent that the researcher is trying to research. These features are interfering when we are playing audio samples. Therefore, a direct approach is more clear and clean for what exactly is being evaluated. Overt opinions are still a part of language attitude, even when, as Lebov saw, covert opinions might affect how people use language and might affect language change. If a researcher is trying to figure out the language attitude of a group of people, overt opinions still count and are still part of how they view this language. This was, because of all of these pros, this was the approach that Coupland and Bishop used in their research.
The results of Bishop and Coupland's research are based on a large online survey of 5,010 participants from the UK, which reacted to 34 different accents. And then these results were established in two charts, one for the social attractiveness of the accents and one of the prestige of the accents. Now, there are some problems with that, as especially in social attractiveness, this perception of this attractiveness of the accent is based solely on personal opinion and is thus rather vague evidence for a scientific chart. And it is also really complicated and can't really be based on the options of a mere 5,000 people when the accents themselves are spoken by millions. And it is quite an assumption that these charts are correct, as everyone must not think the same as these exact 5,000 people which they took their reactions from. And these answers are also quite biased, as many people would probably name their own accent as socially more attractive than others, even if they don't really think that. And this can be quite subconsciously, which is a problem in trying to establish a scientific chart of these accents. The same problem is also with prestige, as there's also this whole thing with social classes which change throughout the years, and accents may lose prestige or gain prestige yearly or even monthly, just based on political movement and subconsciously manipulate the opinions of people, which is why also a chart based on prestige doesn't really have any final results. Case studies. Before we continue with the case studies section, we'll first define it. Our definition of case studies is a type of research in which the researcher goes into depth on one specific case. This is usually on a person or a group.
The pros of deciding to research using a case study is that it sheds light on a more personal experience of the subject. The researcher can ask more in-depth questions of the subject, and the interview can go on as long as needed. The interviewer can also ask clarifying questions of the subject if anything isn't clear. This is one reason why a case study could be better than a questionnaire. Case studies are used to understand subjective observations. A case study is also used to analyze multiple instances of one feature in different sentential contexts. If the researcher is researching an accent and how it is spoken, the researcher can prompt the subject to say a word in a sentence multiple times in multiple ways to understand how the phonetical feature works. However, a case study might not always be the best course of action. A case study cannot easily be applied to a population because a few people cannot be an accurate representation of a population. Since a case study takes so much time and so much effort, there aren't enough resources for a lot of subjects to be interviewed. There is also no good way of dealing with conflicting subjective opinions. If the subjects say that they believe different things, then there is no good way of comparing these things and getting a general idea of what the population might agree with. With a questionnaire, we have more subjects to research, so we can get an average of what the population might think of. Another con of a case study is that there is a higher chance for researcher bias. Researcher bias is when the researcher influences the outcome of what the subject says. In a case study, for example, the researcher would be able to very easily influence what is happening and ask, for example, leading questions so that the subject might say things that he or she would want them to say. Also, things that would confirm their hypothesis or not. A case study is also very subjective to the Hawthorne effect. People act very differently when they are observed. A person might not say exactly what they believe when they are sitting in front of a researcher. However, if they are filling out a questionnaire online, then they might be more ready to say more controversial things that they actually believe. Despite these cons, case studies are still useful. They are very good to use in hypotheses for further research. For example, one could figure out a trend that is happening in a case study that they have done, and then go on to make a hypothesis based off of that trend and use that for a questionnaire.
We'll now be continuing with some examples of case studies so as to further exemplify the pros and cons which were just discussed. The first example was a study conducted by Nikolai in 2010 about the change of identity construction of Finnish exchange students after a stay abroad. The study was conducted as follows. The Finnish students were interviewed before and after their stay abroad so that differences in their identity construction could be perceived by the researchers. Now, what is very positive and a clear pro in this case study is that it sheds light on personal experiences, as was discussed before. It is an in-depth study about their experiences, and the researchers could also ask clarifying questions because it was in an interview style. But a problem with this study here was that when people talk about themselves in an interview, and if they know about it, they will always be subconsciously biased about and trying to make their accent, or in this case their identity, look better. And so it doesn't really matter that they try to be objective, because people will always subconsciously try to make themselves look better, or not even in all cases themselves, but because they knew the point of this experiment was to observe the differences in identity construction, they would subconsciously probably also change how their identity really looks like and how it should be perceived. And they would try to make it look better for both themselves, or either themselves and or for the study. The second example was a study conducted in 2003 by Kreese and Cambere, which studied the accent perception of African immigrant women in Canada. To be more specific, they looked at the accent perception of African immigrant women in the job market to see how their accent is perceived in a job interview. For this, they interviewed 12 African immigrant women as to their experiences in the job market and their search for a job. And their results were as follows. Even though these African immigrant women spoke English fluently at an Oxford level, because they had an African accent, they were regarded as less qualified in the job market and thus had a lower probability of getting a job. Now, it is because they were only interviewing 12 different people, it is also very negative, and there's a con that a few people just cannot be an accurate representation of the many. So it cannot be applied to a population, because for this to work they would have to interview everyone. And there's also, again, the Hawthorne effect, that the people act differently when they are observed and will try to make themselves look better, or in such cases probably more pitiful as to get pity. And there's always chance for that happening subconsciously, and it's not something that can be just turned off or turned on. So these were the examples that we were discussing.
Next, we will talk about the issues with researching and defining accents. First, we will start with sociolects. A sociolect is a dialect spoken in or associated with a specific social group. There are a few reasons why researching and defining a sociolect is important. First of all, we will be able to empirically say what exists. We will be able to say which groups are perceived by other people, how these groups are judged by those people, and what exactly makes up the dialect that this group speaks. Socially, this research is good for highlighting issues. We can make them known to the public about which prejudices exist for which sociolects, and potentially these people with that knowledge will help fight against discrimination. Researching a sociolect may be important, but it is kind of difficult because of things like defining the groups. In order to empirically research a sociolect, we have to figure out who exactly belongs in a social group. One couldn't really just ask the subjects to say which groups they are in, because empirically we would need to be able to prove which groups that they actually belong to. Therefore, researchers are forced to draw artificial lines. I say artificial because a lot of the lines that researchers are forced to draw don't really make sense when things get down to it. One example from a sociolect is from African American Vernacular English. The question of where the line should be drawn could be a question of percentage. How many ancestors does the subject need to have from African American descent in order to be counted as a speaker of African American Vernacular English? Now, if we take another idea for drawing a line, we could say that a person speaks African American Vernacular English when they're in a specific social group that speaks that sociolect. However, proving that proves even more difficult, because the question of how often does one hang out with these kinds of people goes into the question of when exactly we are talking about. For example, are we asking what kind of people they grew up with, or how much percentage of their day do they spend speaking with these people? That question especially is something that a subject would find very hard to define. Another example is from the North American gay accent. Would we count bisexuals to also be speakers of the North American gay accent? Or how much would they have to be sexually attracted to the same gender for it to count? Another idea is if relationship experience is mandatory. If a gay man has never been in a relationship with another gay man before, can we say that he speaks the North American gay accent? Or another example of a line is the idea of at what age do they have to know that they're gay. For example, if we take a subject who is a 40-year-old gay man who just recently figured out that he has been gay, can we say that he speaks the North American gay accent? All of these artificial lines are tricky to deal with. But another overriding difficulty is that group membership does not equal a speaker of the sociolect. A lot of people who, for all intents and purposes, seem to belong to a group could not necessarily speak the sociolect that is stereotypical of that group. So the question remains about how exactly are researchers supposed to form these groups. One possible solution to this difficulty is to measure the perception of group membership instead of measuring group membership itself. In this kind of experiment, test subjects would listen to audio samples and are further prompted to decide whether the audio sample comes from a person inside of said group or outside of said group. Another difficulty researchers have when studying a sociolect is isolating the specific features of the accent. There are many different cues that are used when people decide if a subject is belonging to one social group or another. These cues could be phonological, lexical, or pragmatic, or even more different cues. Isolating these cues from each other is very difficult. If a researcher would like to research a specific cue, let's say a phonological cue, separating that from lexical and pragmatic cues inside of the audio sample proves very difficult. Another problem is that free speech is more authentic but slightly problematic. Free speech is authentic because people speak less carefully, less standard, and more like daily life than when they are reading. However, free speech excerpts are very hard to compare with each other because not every single audio sample will be like the other one, since the person is saying whatever comes to their mind. There are also more interfering variables when a person is talking with free speech. For example, there could be more lexical or pragmatic information that goes into the audio sample that alerts the person, the test subject, that this speaker is in a certain group. One possible solution to this problem is to isolate the variables. However, as we will see in the example that I will talk about in a minute, this is still not a very good representation for real life. The example that I will use to illustrate these issues in researching a sociolect comes from 3 experiments done by Ron Smith and Henry Rogers. Their research questions centered around the question of if a higher pitch range affected a gayness rating. In their experiment, they had audio clips from various people, and they would play these clips for test subjects. This test subject was then asked to give a forced answer of if the speaker was gay or not. Now, one of the issues that they ran into with their experiments was that the audio clips from men that they knew that had self-identified as gay were labeled much more gay in the free speech task than in the other reading tasks by the test subjects. One possible solution Smith and Rogers came up with was to have their open-ended excerpts written out to see if there was any pragmatic information inside of the free speech excerpts that they did not realize would alert the test subject that the audio sample came from a gay person. In this experiment, Smith and Rogers had a new group of experiment subjects read the open-ended excerpts and again give a forced answer of whether the excerpt came from a gay man or a straight man. They found that the reading task and the listening task correlated significantly, which led them to believe that they were not able to extract information that led to the identity of the speaker. In the next experiment, they decided to exclude words in order to get rid of the pragmatic interference. They took the audio samples and completely excluded any words so that what the test subject was hearing was basically what sounded like a schwa that would change in pitch. This way they were able to test and see if the test subjects decided that the speaker was gay or not based on purely pitch alone. And they found that there was indeed a correlation between average pitch and gayness ratings. However, Smith and Rogers were not satisfied by these answers. The question of if the pitch range was actually something that was used in daily life was still relevant, because in the schwa experiment, the only thing that proved was that test subjects, when pitch was the only thing that they needed to make their decision off of, made the decision that a higher pitch range was gay. So the question still remained of if this is actually used in real life, or if this is only used when it is the only feature available. This led them to make a new hypothesis, which that the perceived average pitch was used to decide the gayness rating instead of the objective average pitch. What this means is that when it comes to a register shift, the test subject might just ignore the fact that the pitch has actually dropped lower, and all that they are perceiving is the peaks inside of the specific samples. Register shifts are not always consciously perceived. When someone starts a new sentence in a different register, we tend to ignore that unless it is a very extreme shift. So a shift of a register shift being lower might bring the objective average pitch lower, but the perceived average pitch would stay high. Therefore, they decided to make a new experiment and have shorter audio experts in hopes of avoiding this register shift problem. Therefore, as we have seen, researching a sociolect can be very challenging. Now we will talk about the challenges that are similar to that when researching a regiolect.
Now, as opposed to sociolects, regiolects are dialects spoken in or associated with a specific geographical region. First, we're going to go over some reasons why exactly regiolects should be studied. First of all, they give us insights into the establishment of languages and accents, and also possible reasons as to how languages and accents come to be or how they are changing and differing over time and from region to region. Also, we get some insight as to how these regiolects are perceived and how they affect non-speakers or speakers of a different accent or language. Then researchers can also create maps of geographical boundaries for these accents, which gives us a mapping of where each language or accent is spoken. And it also gives us clues as to how languages change over time or how they change from one language to another, to a more modern one. As with sociolects, there are also difficulties in the research of regiolects. For example, there's the question at which point a speech variation becomes an accent. To say that with an example, that is, if one half of a village pronounces the R in words and the other half of the village doesn't, are those then already two different accents, or is that not enough? Do there have to be many more phonological features differing in both halves of the villages to then count as different accents or dialects? This is something which should be more defined so as to give us more insight or more relevant information in the study of regiolects. Another difficulty is that with the changing geographical accent boundaries, there is also because there is a steady influx of immigration or emigration even, which changes the whole accent boundary and accent mapping constantly. This means that all the research done within a certain region is really temporary and doesn't hold on for long, as nowadays traveling and tourism and even immigration is not something which is as rare as it was earlier. Now it's just a constant change in accent boundaries, which really doesn't leave much room to make long-standing results in research. Another difficulty would be the question as to how closely connected to the circumstances of a certain regiolect you have to be considered speaking this regiolect. A regiolect is not just an accent from a specific place or something, but it's also very closely connected to the culture of this place, because the culture helped build this accent, this regiolect. And so there are questions about how closely you have to know this culture. Does it count that you speak this regiolect if you simply imitate it just because you're good at doing impressions and being able to imitate the people speaking, imitate the people that live there and speak this regiolect? Or do you have to know about their culture and the specific words that probably only appear in their culture to be considered speaking this specific regiolect? As an example to show these difficulties in studying redialects, we'll look at Texas English and whether or not this Texas English even exists. For example, it does share many features with different Southern American English dialects, but it is still seen as its own accent. And that also by many people. So is Texas English actually a specific dialect, or is it just a social construct because so many people believe that it exists? There are a great many difficulties in establishing that, especially as its basic construct. It's the same as Southern American English and undergoes the steps of the Southern vowel shift. So how can we be sure that the Texan English variety is real? This also once again brings up the question of at what point a variation becomes a dialect. Does it have to do a variation and an accent have to differ in one specific phonological feature or a grammatical feature? Is it enough if one part uses a specific word and the other part doesn't? Does that make them dialects, or is it just a variation? This is something which should be defined more concretely to really give us any help and any final results as to how we can really study redialects. With all these opposite views of the Texan English accent or the social construct of Texan English, it is not it can't be said that Texan English exists, as there are many people that say it does, but at the same time there are many people that say it doesn't. I will not delve too far into the isolating features section, as that has been thoroughly discussed in the sociolect section already. As the issue for isolating features, same as for sociolects, also pertains to redialects, as people will always speak carefully when there is a focus on their accent. And it is all just as difficult to isolate cues in redialects when studying them as it is in studying sociolects. Unfortunately, we didn't find any solutions to these problems, since there always seems to be a reason why the empirical research does not reflect real life. However, we believe that a good takeaway to this topic and its issues are to be aware. When presenting the solutions of an empirical study, a researcher must also present these issues along with providing evidence taken from empirical experiments in order to show discrepancies between the empirical values and what they represent in real life.